Have you ever wondered how far someone can fall, and how high they can rise again? What happens when trust is shattered, lives are upended, and the people you thought you knew turn out to be strangers? This is a story about betrayal, resilience, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit. It starts with a single moment, a birthday party that should have been perfect, but instead became the beginning of everything falling apart. And yet, it's also the story of a woman who refused to let her life be defined by pain. Ready to hear how she turned heartbreak into hope? Let's dive in. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air carried just enough chill to make you appreciate being indoors. Claire Mitchell pulled her coat tighter around herself as she stepped out of the car. At 33 years old and 8 months pregnant, every movement felt like an event these days. But tonight wasn't about discomfort or swollen feet, it was her birthday party, after all. And if there was one thing Claire had learned in life, it was that birthdays were sacred occasions, no matter how tired you felt. The restaurant, Romano's, was everything Claire loved, dim lighting casting golden hues over polished wood tables, soft jazz playing faintly in the background, and the smell of garlic bread wafting through the air like a warm embrace. Her sister, Lisa, had gone above and beyond to organize this evening. Claire didn't even have to lift a finger. Well, except for maybe holding her belly while waddling up the steps to the entrance. "Claire!" Lisa exclaimed, rushing toward her with open arms. She wore a floral dress that somehow managed to look both elegant and effortlessly casual. "You made it. I was starting to think you'd chicken out on your own birthday." "I wouldn't dare," Claire replied with a laugh, though her tone betrayed a hint of exhaustion. "Not after all the work you put into this." "Honestly, Lise, did you have to invite half the city?" Lisa waved her hand dismissively. "Oh please, it's not that many people. Besides, everyone loves you." They wanted to celebrate. As they walked inside, Claire couldn't help but feel grateful for her little sister. Lisa always knew how to make magic happen, even when Claire herself barely had the energy to get out of bed lately. Pregnancy fatigue was real, but so was Lisa's determination to ensure her big sister felt special. The private dining room at Romano's was already buzzing with laughter and chatter by the time Claire entered. Friends from high school, colleagues from her pre-maternity leave job, and neighbors who'd become family over the years, all gathered under one roof to honor her. It was overwhelming in the best way possible. And then there was Ryan, her husband of 5 years. He stood near the head of the table, adjusting his tie as he glanced at her arrival. His smile was warm, almost too perfect, but something about it felt distant. Lately, Claire had noticed subtle changes in him, how he seemed distracted during conversations, how his phone constantly buzzed late at night, how sometimes she'd catch him staring off into space instead of engaging with her. She tried not to let it bother her. Maybe it was stress from work. Or maybe it was just the weight of impending fatherhood pressing down on him. Whatever it was, she told herself she'd address it later. Tonight was supposed to be joyful. Ryan approached her now, planting a kiss on her cheek. "Happy birthday, love," he said softly. His voice still sent shivers down her spine, even after all these years. "You look beautiful." "Thanks," Claire murmured, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Though I'm pretty sure beautiful is code for enormous." He chuckled lightly, squeezing her hand before stepping back. "You know that's not true." Before she could respond, Lisa clinked her glass with a fork, drawing everyone's attention. Okay, listen up," she announced, raising her champagne flute. "Tonight we're here to celebrate my amazing sister, Claire. She's strong, kind, hilarious, and currently carrying what might very well be the next president of the United States." Laughter rippled through the room. "So let's raise our glasses to Claire, our hero, our rock, and most importantly, the reason we're all stuffing ourselves with pasta tonight." Everyone cheered, lifting their glasses in unison. Claire blushed, feeling a mix of pride and embarrassment. As the toast ended and people returned to their conversations, she allowed herself a moment to soak it all in. This was happiness, right? Surrounded by loved ones, basking in their affection. Everything should have been perfect. But perfection has a funny way of cracking under pressure. Just as Claire was about to sit down, the door to the dining room swung open. Heads turned, conversations paused, and suddenly, all eyes were on the newcomer. A woman strode in confidently, her presence commanding attention like a spotlight. She wore a striking red dress that hugged her figure flawlessly, its bold color making her stand out amidst the muted tones of the room. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor with each step, echoing louder than they should have. Time seemed to slow as Claire took her in, the sleek black hair cascading over her shoulders, the sharp green eyes scanning the crowd, and finally, the smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. There was something unsettlingly familiar about her, though Claire couldn't quite place it. All she knew was that this woman didn't belong here, not in this cozy, intimate gathering meant for friends and family. Yet there she was, standing in the doorway, looking as though she owned the place. And worst of all, her gaze landed directly on Ryan. The room fell silent. Every conversation, every laugh, every clink of glass against glass, it all stopped as Julia stepped further into the dining area. Her red dress seemed to glow under the soft lighting, a flare of defiance in an otherwise warm and intimate setting. Claire felt her stomach tighten, not from the baby kicking, but from something far more primal. Instinct. Something wasn't right. Who are you? Claire asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to sound calm. She glanced at Ryan, hoping for some explanation, some reassurance that this stranger was nothing more than a misplaced guest or perhaps someone Lisa had invited without telling her. But when she looked at him, his face was pale, his jaw clenched so tightly it might shatter. He didn't say a word. Julia's smirk widened, her green eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Oh, Claire," she said smoothly, her tone dripping with mockery. "You really don't know? I thought by now you'd have figured it out." Figured what out? Claire's mind raced, trying to piece together fragments of memory. Had they met before? Was this one of Ryan's coworkers? A distant relative? No, none of those explanations fit the venomous energy radiating off this woman. "I'm Julia," the intruder continued, taking another deliberate step forward. Her heels clicked against the floor like gunshots in the suffocating silence. "And for the past 6 months, I've been sleeping with your husband." The words hit Claire like a freight train. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The world tilted on its axis, and everything around her, the laughter that had once filled the room, the warmth of friends and family, the comforting aroma of Italian cuisine, felt impossibly distant, as if she were watching it all through fogged glass. "No," Claire whispered, shaking her head. "That's not. You're lying." She turned to Ryan again, desperate for him to deny it. To tell her this was some cruel joke. But he just stood there, frozen, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His silence spoke louder than any confession ever could. Julia laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that echoed through the stillness. "Oh, honey, do you really think I'd make something like this up? Look at him." She gestured toward Ryan with a flick of her wrist. "He hasn't even tried to defend himself. Isn't that telling?" Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers. But instead, she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to process what was happening. It was as though her body had betrayed her, leaving her trapped in this nightmare. Then, without warning, Julia moved closer, her movements fluid and predatory. Before anyone could react, she reached for the centerpiece on the table, a towering cake decorated with delicate swirls of frosting and edible flowers. With one swift motion, she grabbed a handful of the sugary confection and smashed it directly into Claire's chest. The impact was jarring, both physically and emotionally. Frosting smeared across Claire's blouse, sticking to her skin and clinging to the fabric stretched tight over her swollen belly. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by nervous laughter from a few of Ryan's colleagues. They weren't laughing with her, they were laughing at her. At her humiliation. At her pain. Claire stared down at the mess on her shirt, her vision blurring as tears welled in her eyes. She felt exposed, violated, shattered. And then came the pain, a sharp, searing sensation low in her abdomen that made her double over. She clutched her belly instinctively, her breath hitching as panic set in. "Something's wrong," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "The baby." Ryan finally snapped out of his stupor, rushing to her side. "Claire," he exclaimed, his face etched with concern. Whether it was genuine worry or guilt-driven panic, Claire couldn't tell. All she knew was that she needed help. Now. But before anyone could respond, Claire collapsed to her knees, clutching her stomach as waves of agony crashed over her. The room spun, voices became muffled, and all she could focus on was the unbearable pressure in her lower body. Somewhere in the distance, she heard Lisa shouting, "Call 911. Somebody call 911. As darkness crept into the edges of her vision, Claire's last coherent thought was of betrayal, not just Ryan's, but her own body's. In that moment, she felt utterly alone. The chaos in the room escalated as Claire's collapse became the focal point of everyone's attention. Lisa was the first to reach her sister, dropping to her knees beside Claire with a look of sheer terror etched across her face. "Claire. Claire, can you hear me?" she pleaded, her voice trembling with panic. She placed a hand on Claire's shoulder, trying to steady her, but Claire's body was racked with spasms of pain. Ryan, meanwhile, remained frozen just a few feet away. His hands hovered uselessly at his sides, as if unsure whether he should step forward or retreat entirely. For someone who had always prided himself on being composed and in control, this moment exposed him for what he truly was, a man paralyzed by guilt and fear. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. Instead, his gaze darted between Claire, Lisa, and the growing crowd of onlookers, all of whom were now whispering among themselves. And then it happened, Claire's water broke. The sudden gush soaked through her dress and pooled on the floor beneath her, leaving an unmistakable mark of urgency. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, each one punctuated by a low moan of agony. "It's too early," she whimpered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "The baby, it's too early." Lisa immediately whipped out her phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "We need an ambulance right now," she shouted into the receiver, her tone sharp and commanding despite the tremor in her voice. "My sister is 8 months pregnant, and she's going into labor prematurely. Please hurry." Julia, who had been standing smugly near the entrance only moments before, suddenly looked less confident. Her icy smirk melted away, replaced by wide eyes filled with dawning horror. As she watched Claire struggle on the floor, clutching her belly and crying out in pain, the reality of what she'd done began to sink in. This wasn't just some petty act of revenge, this was a life-threatening emergency, and she had played a role in causing it. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no sound emerged. She took a hesitant step backward, her high heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The weight of the situation bore down on her like a crushing wave, and for the first time that evening, Julia appeared human. Vulnerable, even. But there was no undoing what had already been set in motion. Within minutes, the paramedics arrived, their presence cutting through the tension like a blade. They moved swiftly, assessing Claire's condition and preparing to transport her to the hospital. One of them knelt beside her, speaking in calm, reassuring tones. "You're going to be okay, ma'am. We'll get you stabilized and take care of both you and your baby." As they carefully lifted Claire onto a stretcher, Lisa stayed glued to her side, holding her hand tightly. "I'm here, Claire," she murmured, brushing hair away from her sister's damp forehead. "You're not alone. Just hang on." But when Lisa turned back toward Ryan, her expression transformed into one of pure fury. Her normally kind brown eyes burned with rage as she stormed over to him, jabbing a finger into his chest. "You did this," she spat, her voice low but venomous. "This is all your fault." Ryan recoiled, raising his hands defensively. "Lisa, please, No," she interrupted, cutting him off with a sharp slap across the face. The sound echoed through the room, silencing any lingering murmurs from the guests. "Don't you dare try to explain yourself. You've done enough damage. Stay away from her. Stay away from my family." He flinched, rubbing his stinging cheek, but made no move to argue. Guilt was written all over his face, plain as day. When he tried to follow the paramedics out of the restaurant, Lisa stepped directly into his path, blocking him with surprising strength. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You don't get to play hero now. You don't deserve to be there." For a moment, Ryan hesitated, torn between his desire to see Claire and the knowledge that Lisa was right. He had no place at her side after everything he'd done. Defeated, he lowered his head and took a step back, letting the paramedics wheel Claire out without him. By the time the ambulance doors slammed shut and the vehicle sped off into the night, the once celebratory atmosphere of Romano's had dissolved completely. What remained was a scene of devastation, shattered relationships, broken trust, and the haunting possibility that Claire's premature labor might cost her more than just her dignity. As Lisa climbed into a taxi to follow the ambulance, she cast one final glance at Ryan, her glare promising retribution. "If anything happens to her, or that baby, you'll regret it for the rest of your life," she said coldly, slamming the car door behind her. And with that, Ryan was left standing alone in the wreckage of his own making, the echoes of Julia's cruel actions, and his own betrayal, hanging heavily in the air. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor buzzed faintly overhead, casting an unforgiving glow over the sterile white walls. Claire was wheeled straight into the delivery room, her cries of pain echoing down the hallway as nurses and doctors worked frantically to stabilize both her and the baby. The urgency in their voices was palpable, each command sharp and precise as they prepared for an emergency cesarean section. 8 months pregnant, too early, far too early, but there was no time to waste. Every second counted. Meanwhile, in the waiting area, Ryan sat slumped in a hard plastic chair, his head buried in his hands. His tie was loosened, his shirt untucked, and his usually polished appearance had deteriorated into something disheveled and broken. He hadn't been allowed to see Claire, not after Lisa's parting words, and now he could only wait, consumed by guilt and dread. What if something went wrong? What if he lost not just his wife but also their unborn child? The thought was unbearable. But even as those fears gnawed at him, another storm was brewing, one that would soon make its way into the public eye. Unbeknownst to Ryan, someone at the restaurant had captured Julia's explosive entrance on video. It hadn't taken long for the clip to circulate online, spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. Within hours, it had gone viral, racking up thousands of views, comments, and shares. The hashtag Claire Mitchell quickly trended locally, then nationally, as people weighed in on the shocking scene. Ryan's phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, vibrating so violently it nearly fell off his lap. At first, he ignored it, assuming it was work-related emails or texts from concerned friends. But when he finally glanced at the screen, his blood ran cold. Notifications flooded in, missed calls, angry voicemails, scathing text messages, all directed at him. Clients from his firm were pulling out left and right, citing ethical concerns, and questioning how they could trust a man who couldn't even stay faithful to his own wife. One message stood out in particular. This is unacceptable behavior for someone representing our company. Consider this notice of termination effective immediately. His stomach churned. This wasn't just personal anymore, it was professional suicide. His career, the thing he'd poured years of his life into building, was crumbling before his eyes. And all because of one reckless decision. One selfish act. As if things couldn't get worse, Lisa stormed into the waiting room, her face flushed with anger. She carried herself with a quiet intensity that made Ryan shrink back instinctively. In her hand, she held her phone, the screen glowing ominously. Without saying a word, she thrust it toward him, forcing him to look at what was displayed. It was the video. There it was, plain as day, Julia striding into the restaurant, smashing cake into Claire's chest, and Claire collapsing in agony. The footage was grainy but unmistakable, capturing every humiliating detail. Below the video, hundreds of comments piled up, ranging from sympathy for Claire to outright vitriol aimed at Ryan. Some called him a monster, others labeled him a coward. None of them were kind. "You see this?" Lisa hissed, her voice low and trembling with barely contained rage. "This is what happens when you destroy someone's life. You think I'm going to let you get away with this? You think anyone will?" Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could he possibly defend himself against this? Against her? Lisa wasn't done yet. With a flick of her thumb, she opened another app on her phone, a messaging thread with Claire's lawyer. Before Ryan could stop her, she hit send, attaching the video along with a brief note, * evidence for Claire's case. File charges immediately. *. What are you doing? Ryan stammered, panic rising in his chest. You can't. I can, Lisa interrupted, cutting him off with a glare that could freeze fire. And I am. You don't deserve to walk away from this unscathed, Ryan. Not after what you've done to my sister. Not after what you've done to that baby. Her words struck him like a physical blow. For the first time, he realized the full weight of his actions. This wasn't just about cheating, it was about betrayal, humiliation, and potentially endangering 2 lives. Lives that meant everything to Lisa. Lives that should have meant everything to him. Lisa turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Ryan alone in the suffocating silence of the waiting room. Outside, the world continued spinning, oblivious to the turmoil inside these walls. But for Ryan, time seemed to stand still. Each tick of the clock felt heavier than the last, dragging him deeper into the abyss of his own making. He stared blankly at his phone, watching as more notifications rolled in. Another client dropped. Another colleague sent a passive-aggressive text. Another stranger posted a hateful comment online. It was overwhelming, suffocating, unbearable. Yet none of it compared to the crushing realization that he might lose Claire, and their baby, forever. And as much as he wanted to run, to escape the mess he'd created, he knew there was nowhere to hide. Not from the truth. Not from himself. The hours dragged on in the hospital, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like an endless wait, a doctor emerged from the delivery room, his scrubs stained with sweat and urgency. His expression was calm but weary as he approached Lisa, who had been pacing anxiously outside. Ryan hovered nearby, desperate for any news, but Lisa shot him a glare that kept him at bay. "Ms. Mitchell," the doctor began, addressing Lisa directly, "Claire delivered a baby girl earlier this evening. She's small, just under 4 pounds, but she's a fighter." Lisa exhaled sharply, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank God," she whispered, clutching her chest. "Is Claire okay? And the baby?" The doctor nodded slowly. "Claire is stable, though understandably exhausted. The labor took a toll on her body, and we're monitoring her closely. As for the baby," he paused, his tone softening further. "She's premature, so she'll need specialized care in the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, for the foreseeable future. We've named her Ava, a beautiful name, if I may say so." Ava, Lisa repeated softly, letting the name roll off her tongue. It suited her niece perfectly, delicate yet strong, fragile yet full of potential. She turned to look at Ryan, who stood frozen a few feet away, his face pale and drawn. For a brief moment, their eyes met, but Lisa quickly looked away, unwilling to let him share in this moment of relief. Ryan stepped forward hesitantly. "Can I see them?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Please, I need to see Claire and the baby." The doctor shook his head firmly. "I'm sorry, sir, but Ms. Mitchell has requested that you not be allowed near her or the baby at this time. Hospital policy respects patient wishes, especially in sensitive situations like this." Ryan felt as though the floor had been ripped out from under him. He opened his mouth to protest, but Lisa cut him off before he could speak. "Don't even try," she snapped, her voice cold and sharp. "You lost the right to be part of their lives when you betrayed my sister. Claire already contacted a lawyer. You'll hear from them soon enough." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. A lawyer? Was she really going to take legal action against him? The thought made his stomach churn. He wanted to argue, to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but Lisa wasn't giving him the chance. She turned her back on him and followed the doctor down the hallway, leaving Ryan standing alone in the sterile corridor, surrounded by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of monitors beeping. Later that night, Ryan drove home in a daze. The streets were eerily quiet, the world outside seeming indifferent to the chaos raging inside him. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Would Claire ever forgive him? What would happen to Ava? How could he possibly fix the mess he'd created? When he arrived at the house he shared with Claire, the sight that greeted him only deepened his despair. The front door was locked, and no amount of jiggling the handle or knocking elicited a response. Frowning, he pulled out his key and slid it into the lock, only to find that it didn't work. Confused, he tried again, more forcefully this time, but still nothing. It wasn't until he noticed the new deadbolt above the doorknob that reality sank in. Claire, or perhaps Lisa, had changed the locks. He was officially locked out of his own home. Ryan slumped against the doorframe, defeated. The weight of everything, the affair, the public humiliation, the premature birth of his daughter, the loss of his career, the betrayal etched across Claire's face, it all crashed over him at once. He buried his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking as sobs racked his body. For the first time in years, Ryan cried, not out of self-pity, but out of genuine grief. Grief for the family he'd destroyed. Grief for the trust he'd shattered. Grief for the tiny life fighting to survive in the NICU, a life he might never get to hold or know. As he sat there in the dark, the enormity of his mistakes became impossible to ignore. There was no quick fix, no easy way to undo the damage he'd caused. All he could do now was face the consequences, and hope, somehow, that redemption might still be possible. The soft beeping of machines filled the hospital room, a steady rhythm that underscored Claire's fragile state. She stirred awake, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal dull, exhausted eyes. For a moment, she simply stared at the ceiling, trying to piece together where she was and why everything felt so heavy, not just physically, but emotionally. Then it all came rushing back, the birthday party, Julia's cruel entrance, the pain, the premature labor. Ava. Her baby girl. "Hey," Lisa said softly, pulling a chair closer to the bed. Her voice was gentle, but there was an edge of tension beneath it. "How are you feeling?" Claire swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Like I've been hit by a truck," she rasped, managing a weak smile. "But... Ava? Is she okay?" Lisa nodded, though her expression remained somber. "She's holding on, Claire. The doctors say she's a fighter. You should be proud." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes as relief washed over her, followed quickly by guilt. She hadn't even seen her daughter yet, hadn't held her or kissed her tiny forehead. What kind of mother was she? And then, almost instinctively, her thoughts turned to Ryan. Where was he? Why wasn't he here? Before she could ask, Lisa pulled out her phone and hesitated for a moment, debating whether this was the right time. But there was no good time for what she was about to show Claire. With a deep breath, she handed the device over. You need to see this, she said quietly. Claire frowned, confusion furrowing her brow as she took the phone. The screen lit up, and suddenly, she was staring at herself, at the chaos of her own birthday party. There she was, standing frozen in shock as Julia smashed cake into her chest. The video captured every humiliating detail, every gasp from the crowd, every tear streaming down Claire's face. It ended with her collapsing to the floor, clutching her belly in agony. For a long moment, Claire didn't move. Her hands trembled as she replayed the clip once, then twice, unable to look away. Anger began to simmer inside her, bubbling to the surface until it threatened to boil over. Everyone saw this, she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. This is, everywhere? Lisa nodded grimly. It went viral hours ago. People are talking about it all over social media. Ryan's career is toast, he's lost clients, his reputation is ruined. Even Julia got fired when her boss found out about the scandal. Claire clenched her jaw, her grip tightening around the phone. Part of her wanted to feel vindicated, to revel in the fact that Ryan and Julia were paying for their actions, but another part of her just felt hollow. None of this changed what had happened. None of it brought back the trust they'd shattered. Most importantly, none of it erased the fear she still carried for Ava's health. As if sensing her turmoil, Lisa reached out and placed a comforting hand on Claire's arm. Listen, Claire, she began, her tone firm but compassionate. You don't deserve any of this. Not the betrayal, not the public humiliation, and certainly not the stress that put you in this hospital bed. That's why I called your lawyer last night. They're handling everything. Claire blinked, startled. My lawyer? Handling what? Lisa hesitated again, then leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. Divorce papers. Full custody of Ava. Child support. Everything you're entitled to, and more. Ryan doesn't get to walk away from this without consequences. Claire's heart sank. Divorce. The word felt foreign, alien, like something that belonged to someone else's life, not hers. She thought about the years she and Ryan had shared, the laughter, the dreams, the promises they'd made. How could it all come to this? How could love turn into such bitter ashes? But as much as it hurt, she knew Lisa was right. Ryan had betrayed her in the worst possible way, and she couldn't let him near her, or Ava, ever again. If not for herself, then for her daughter. For the little girl fighting for her life in the NICU. I'll sign them, Claire said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Whatever needs to be done, I'll do it. Lisa squeezed her hand, pride shining in her eyes. That's my sister. Strong and smart. Don't worry, we're going to make sure you and Ava are taken care of. No matter what. Meanwhile, across town, Ryan sat alone in his car, parked outside the house he could no longer enter. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, each one a fresh reminder of how far he'd fallen. News outlets had picked up the story, labeling him a cheating husband whose infidelity had nearly cost his wife and unborn child their lives. Social media users roasted him mercilessly, calling him every name in the book. Even his colleagues avoided him, whispering behind his back whenever he dared set foot in the office. And then there was Julia, or rather, there wasn't Julia anymore. After losing her job, she'd disappeared completely, blocking his calls and deleting her social media accounts. Whether she felt remorse or simply wanted to escape the fallout, Ryan didn't know. Either way, he was utterly alone. When his phone buzzed yet again, he glanced at the screen expecting another hateful message. Instead, it was an email from Claire's lawyer. Attached were the divorce papers, along with a detailed custody agreement granting Claire full parental rights to Ava. The document was cold, clinical, and devastatingly final. Ryan stared at the screen, his vision blurring as tears filled his eyes. He had known this day might come, but that didn't make it any easier. Signing those papers would mean letting go, not just of Claire, but of the family he'd always dreamed of having. Of the chance to hold his daughter, to watch her grow, to be the father he'd promised himself he'd become. But what choice did he have? Claire didn't want him anymore. Maybe she never would again. And honestly, who could blame her? With shaking hands, Ryan scrolled to the bottom of the email and clicked reply. 2 words appeared on the screen before he hit send. I agree. The morning sun filtered weakly through the blinds of Ryan's office, casting long shadows across his cluttered desk. He sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the stack of papers in front of him, reports, client briefs, and memos he hadn't touched in days. His once immaculate workspace now mirrored the chaos unraveling inside him. The weight of everything, the scandal, the divorce, the loss of his family, pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. And yet, as overwhelming as it all was, he knew this was only the beginning. Just as Ryan began to steel himself for another grueling day of avoiding eye contact with coworkers, a sharp knock echoed against his door. Before he could respond, it swung open, revealing his boss, Greg, flanked by 2 members of the firm's executive board. Their expressions were grim, their body language stiff and formal. This wasn't a casual check-in, it was an intervention. Ryan, Greg said curtly, gesturing for him to stand. We need to talk. Conference room. Now. Ryan felt his stomach drop. He nodded mutely, rising from his chair and following them down the hallway. Every step felt heavier than the last, each click of his dress shoes against the polished floor amplifying the dread building in his chest. By the time they reached the conference room, his palms were slick with sweat, and his tie suddenly felt impossibly tight around his neck. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The blinds had been drawn, casting the room in dim light that did little to soften the severity of the moment. Greg took his seat at the head of the table while the other executives arranged themselves along either side, leaving Ryan to sit alone at the far end, a subtle but unmistakable power play. Greg wasted no time getting to the point. Ryan, you're aware of the situation that's been circulating online, he began, his tone clipped and devoid of sympathy. Your personal life has become public spectacle, and unfortunately, it's reflecting poorly on this firm. Clients are pulling out left and right. Our reputation is taking a hit because of your actions. Ryan opened his mouth to defend himself, but Greg raised a hand, silencing him before he could speak. Let me be clear, we can't afford distractions like this. Not now, not ever. So here's the deal, you resign quietly, or we terminate your employment effective immediately. Your choice. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Resignation versus termination, it wasn't much of a choice at all. Either way, his career was over. The job he'd worked so hard for, sacrificed so much for, was slipping through his fingers. But what else could he do? Fight back? Deny responsibility? There was no denying the truth, not when the evidence was plastered all over social media for the world to see. I'll resign, Ryan muttered, his voice barely audible. The shame burned in his throat as he forced the words out. Effective today. Greg nodded approvingly, though there was no warmth in his expression. Good. We'll draft the paperwork and make sure your exit is handled discreetly. For both our sakes. With that, the meeting adjourned, leaving Ryan sitting alone in the conference room. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning overhead. He stared at the empty chairs around him, feeling more isolated than he ever had in his life. In one fell swoop, he'd lost not just his job, but also any semblance of stability or purpose. What was he supposed to do now? Later that evening, as Ryan sat nursing a glass of whiskey in his barren apartment, a temporary rental until he figured out his next move, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. Hoping against hope it might be Claire, he snatched it up eagerly. Instead, it was a number he didn't recognize. Hesitant, he answered anyway. "Hello?" he said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Are you kidding me right now?" Julia spat before he could finish speaking. Her tone was venomous, laced with fury and disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us?" Ryan winced, holding the phone away from his ear as her tirade continued. "Julia, No, shut up," she snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Because of you, I'm ruined. My career is over, my reputation is trash, and everyone thinks I'm some psycho homewrecker. Do you know how many interviews I've gone to since this whole mess blew up? 0. Nobody will hire me." Her anger was palpable, radiating through the line like a live wire. Ryan tried to interject again, desperate to explain, or apologize, but she wasn't having it. "You dragged me into your screwed-up life, Ryan," she seethed. "And for what? So you could throw me under the bus when things got tough? Well, congratulations. You've officially destroyed everything, for both of us." Before he could respond, the line went dead. Ryan stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. She was gone. Just like that, Julia had severed all ties, leaving him completely alone. No allies, no support system, nothing. He sank back onto the couch, clutching the phone tightly in his hand. The realization hit him harder than he expected. This was rock bottom. His marriage was over, his career was in shambles, and the woman who had caused so much destruction in his life wanted nothing more to do with him. All that remained was the lingering ache of regret, and the knowledge that he had brought every bit of this upon himself. As he poured himself another drink, Ryan couldn't help but wonder if redemption was even possible anymore. Or if he'd spend the rest of his life paying for the choices he'd made. The morning sun streamed through the blinds of Claire's new apartment, casting warm golden streaks across the hardwood floors. It wasn't much, a modest one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a quiet building, but it was hers. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. The hospital had finally discharged her earlier that week, and after spending countless nights lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, she realized she couldn't go back to the house she'd shared with Ryan. Too many memories lingered there, too much pain embedded in its walls. So, with Lisa's help, she'd packed up what little she wanted to keep and started fresh. Claire stood in the kitchen now, cradling a steaming mug of chamomile tea between her hands. The scent was soothing, almost medicinal, helping to calm the constant hum of anxiety that seemed to follow her everywhere these days. She glanced over at the small bassinet set up near the window, where Ava lay sleeping soundly. Her daughter was still so tiny, her fragile body swaddled snugly in a soft pink blanket. Every time Claire looked at her, she felt a mixture of awe and heartbreak. Awe at the miracle of her existence, and heartbreak at the circumstances surrounding her birth. But despite the weight of everything, the betrayal, the scandal, the premature delivery, Claire refused to let herself drown. She owed it to Ava to be strong, to create a life worth living. And for the first time since the night of her birthday party, she believed she might actually be able to do it. Lisa burst through the door just then, arms laden with grocery bags. "I come bearing gifts," she announced cheerfully, kicking the door shut behind her. She set the bags down on the counter and began unpacking, fresh fruits, vegetables, organic baby formula, and even a pint of Claire's favorite ice cream. "Thought you could use some supplies, and maybe a little treat for yourself." Claire smiled faintly, setting her tea aside to help unload the groceries. "You didn't have to do all this, Lise," she said softly. "But thank you." "Of course I did," Lisa replied firmly, giving her sister a pointed look. "You're starting over, Claire. That means leaning on people who love you. Which reminds me," she pulled out a folded piece of paper from her purse and handed it to Claire. "Here. Your first therapy session is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon." Claire hesitated, staring at the paper without taking it. Therapy. The idea made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was fear of confronting the emotions she'd been burying for so long. Either way, she knew Lisa wouldn't take no for an answer. "I don't know, Lise," Claire murmured, biting her lip. "Do I really need it?" Lisa placed a hand on her shoulder, her expression softening. "Yes, you do. You've been through hell, Claire. No one expects you to just bounce back from that, not even you. Talking to someone can help. Trust me." After a long pause, Claire nodded reluctantly and took the paper. "Okay. I'll go." "That's my girl," Lisa said with a proud smile, squeezing her shoulder before turning back to the groceries. "Now, let's make sure we've got everything ready for Ava's next feeding. Oh, and Mom called earlier, she wants to come visit next weekend. Think you're up for that?" Claire chuckled weakly, shaking her head. "One day at a time, Lise. Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Later that evening, after Lisa had left and Ava was settled into her bassinet, Claire sat alone on the couch, staring out the window at the city skyline. The lights twinkled like stars against the darkening sky, offering a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. Slowly, she reached for her phone and opened the Notes app. Over the past few days, she'd started jotting down ideas for her future, a list of things she wanted to accomplish, places she wanted to see, goals she hoped to achieve. Writing them down gave her a sense of control, however small, over a life that had once felt completely out of her hands. At the top of the list were 2 words: be happy. It sounded simple enough, but Claire knew it wouldn't be easy. Happiness wasn't something that happened overnight, it was built, brick by brick, moment by moment. And right now, she was determined to lay the foundation. Her thoughts drifted to Ava, sleeping peacefully just a few feet away. Despite everything, Claire felt a flicker of hope. This was her chance to rewrite her story, to build a life filled with love, resilience, and joy. Not just for herself, but for her daughter too. As she turned off the lamp beside her and curled up under a blanket, Claire whispered softly into the darkness, "We're going to be okay, Ava. I promise." And for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed it. The days blurred together for Ryan, each one indistinguishable from the last. His mornings began with the same ritual, staring at the ceiling of his cramped studio apartment, replaying every mistake he'd ever made in vivid detail. The shame was relentless, gnawing at him like a persistent ache that refused to fade. He had lost everything: his career, his reputation, his family, and now, as he sat alone in silence, he couldn't help but wonder if redemption was even possible. But Ryan wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Somewhere deep inside, buried beneath layers of guilt and regret, there flickered a tiny ember of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way back into Claire's life. Back into Ava's life. After all, they were still his family, or at least, they used to be. Surely, they deserved better than the man he had been. Maybe, if he worked hard enough, he could become someone worthy of their forgiveness. With that thought driving him, Ryan decided to reach out. He picked up his phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing Claire's number. It rang twice, 3 times, then went straight to voicemail. He hadn't expected anything different, she hadn't answered any of his previous calls either. But this time, instead of hanging up, he left a message. "Claire," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I messed up so badly. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. For everything. I want to make things right. If there's any chance, any way at all, that we can talk, even just once, I'll do whatever it takes. Please. He hung up before he could second-guess himself, his heart pounding in his chest. Part of him hoped she'd listen to the message, while another part braced for rejection. Either way, leaving the voicemail felt like a step forward, a small act of courage in a sea of despair. Days passed without a response. Ryan tried calling again, sent texts, even wrote letters that he mailed to her new address. Each attempt was met with silence, a deafening reminder of how far he'd fallen. Still, he refused to accept defeat. Instead, he threw himself into rebuilding what little he could salvage of his life. He updated his resume, applied for jobs, any job, and scoured online forums for advice on co-parenting after divorce. Anything to keep moving forward. Finally, after weeks of waiting, an envelope arrived in the mail. Ryan tore it open with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the legal document inside. It was official. The court had granted Claire full custody of Ava, with limited supervised visitation rights for him. The ruling hit him like a punch to the gut, though he knew it was fair. How could Claire trust him around their daughter after everything he'd done? Still, the thought of seeing Ava, even under strict supervision, ignited a spark of determination within him. This was his chance to prove himself, not just to Claire, but to his daughter too. He vowed to show up, to be present, to be the father Ava deserved, no matter how long it took. That weekend, Ryan attended his first supervised visitation session. The setting was sterile and impersonal, a bland community center room with plastic chairs, a low table scattered with toys, and a social worker stationed nearby to monitor their interaction. When Claire walked in carrying Ava, Ryan's breath caught in his throat. She looked tired but resolute, her gaze fixed firmly ahead as she avoided looking at him. "Hi," Ryan said softly, stepping forward cautiously. "Thank you for bringing her." Claire didn't respond, instead placing Ava gently into the high chair provided. Her movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as she adjusted the straps and handed the baby a teething toy. Then, without meeting Ryan's eyes, she turned and walked to the opposite corner of the room, where she sat down and stared blankly at the wall. Ryan swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus on Ava. She was growing so quickly, her tiny features beginning to resemble Claire's more with each passing day. He knelt beside her, speaking softly as he introduced himself. "Hey, sweetheart. Do you remember me? I'm your dad." Ava gurgled happily, reaching out to grab his finger with her chubby little hand. For a fleeting moment, Ryan allowed himself to feel a glimmer of joy. She didn't know who he was, not yet, but she trusted him instinctively, the way babies always did. That trust was a gift, and Ryan swore to honor it. As the hour ticked by, Ryan did everything he could to engage with Ava, playing peekaboo, reading her a story, and singing lullabies he barely remembered the words to. Every laugh, every smile, every curious glance she gave him felt like a lifeline pulling him back from the brink of despair. When the session ended, Claire stood abruptly and gathered Ava into her arms without sparing Ryan a single word. As she walked toward the door, Ryan called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Claire, wait." She paused but didn't turn around. "What?" she asked flatly, her tone devoid of warmth. Ryan hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I want you to know I'm trying. Really trying. I don't expect forgiveness, not now, maybe not ever, but I promise I'll do better. For Ava." For a moment, Claire said nothing. Then, without turning back, she replied quietly, "Prove it." And with that, she was gone, leaving Ryan standing alone in the empty room. Her words echoed in his mind long after she'd left. Prove it, two simple words, yet they carried the weight of a challenge, and perhaps, a sliver of hope. It had been nearly 6 months since the night of Claire's birthday party, the night that changed everything. Life had moved forward in fits and starts, but some wounds still lingered, buried beneath layers of resilience and determination. Claire was adjusting to her new normal as a single mother, navigating the challenges of raising Ava while piecing together the fragments of her shattered life. Therapy had helped, more than she'd expected, but there were moments when the anger would resurface, sharp and unexpected, like a splinter she couldn't quite pull out. One such moment came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Claire was folding laundry in her living room when her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email, the subject line reading simply, "I'm sorry." Her stomach tightened as she opened it, recognizing Julia's name immediately. "Claire," the message began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I wouldn't blame you if you deleted this without reading further. But I need to say this, I owe it to you. What I did was wrong. Cruel. Unforgivable. And I've spent every day since trying to understand why I acted the way I did. I've started therapy, and through that process, I've come to realize how much pain I caused, not just you, but everyone involved. If there's any chance at all that we could meet, even briefly, I'd like to apologize in person. Whatever you decide is fine, it's more than I deserve." Claire stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Part of her wanted to ignore the email altogether, to delete it and move on without giving Julia another thought. But another part, the part that craved closure, wondered if hearing her out might finally bring an end to the lingering bitterness she carried. After a long pause, she typed a response. "Fine. Meet me tomorrow at Romano's. 3 p.m. Bring Lisa with you. The next afternoon, Claire arrived at the restaurant with Lisa by her side. She hadn't set foot in Romano's since the disastrous birthday party, and walking through the doors brought back a flood of memories she wasn't ready to confront. But she squared her shoulders, holding Ava close in her arms as they took a seat at a quiet corner table. Julia arrived moments later, looking nothing like the confident woman who had stormed into Claire's life months earlier. Her once striking red dress had been replaced by simple jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. There was no trace of the icy smirk that had haunted Claire's nightmares, only vulnerability etched across her face. "Thank you for meeting me," Julia said softly, taking a tentative seat across from them. Her voice wavered, betraying nerves that Claire hadn't expected to see. "I know I don't deserve your time." Claire studied her silently for a moment before responding. "You're right, you don't. But here we are." Julia nodded, accepting the judgment without argument. I don't know where to start," she admitted, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "What I did to you was cruel. Selfish. I let my own pain and anger dictate my actions, and in doing so, I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. You didn't deserve any of it." Lisa leaned forward, her expression sharp. "Why did you do it, Julia? Why go after Claire like that? What gave you the right?" Julia flinched at the accusation but didn't shy away. "Because I was broken," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "My relationship with Ryan, it wasn't love. It was desperation. I thought I needed him, that he could fix something inside me that felt irreparably damaged. But the truth is, I was using him just as much as he was using me. When I found out about your pregnancy," she glanced at Claire, tears welling in her eyes. "I panicked. I lashed out because I was scared, not of losing him, but of being alone again. And instead of dealing with those feelings, I took them out on you." The room fell silent as Julia wiped her eyes, composing herself before continuing. "Therapy has helped me see how toxic my behavior was, not just toward you, but toward myself. I can't undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I'm working on becoming someone better. Someone who doesn't destroy other people's lives to feel whole." Claire listened intently, her grip tightening protectively around Ava. For so long, she had imagined confronting Julia, shouting every angry word she'd bottled up inside. But now, faced with Julia's raw honesty, she found herself at a loss. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was tempered by something else, understanding. "I don't forgive you," Claire said finally, her tone firm but measured. "What you did, it's not something I can just forget. But I will say this, holding on to hate isn't helping me heal. It's only keeping me stuck. So maybe this is my way of letting go, not for you, but for me." Julia nodded, visibly shaken but grateful. "That's more than I deserve," she murmured. "Thank you." As they stood to leave, Claire extended her hand, a gesture of peace rather than reconciliation. Julia hesitated before shaking it, her touch light and fleeting. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd outside. Back at home that evening, Claire sat on the couch with Ava nestled against her chest. Lisa perched on the edge of the coffee table, watching her sister carefully. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Claire smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from Ava's forehead. "Yeah," she replied. "For the first time in a long time, I think I am." And for the first time, she meant it. The months had been unkind to Ryan. Once polished and confident, he now looked like a shadow of his former self. His tailored suits had been replaced by worn jeans and faded work shirts, the kind you'd expect to see on someone punching a clock at a construction site or loading dock, because that's exactly what he was doing now. After losing his career in finance, Ryan had taken whatever job he could find, desperate to scrape together enough money to survive. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept a roof over his head and food on the table. Despite the long hours and physical exhaustion, Ryan couldn't stop thinking about Claire and Ava. Every night, as he lay awake in his cramped studio apartment, their faces haunted him. He replayed every moment they'd shared, the laughter, the love, the promises he'd broken, and wondered if there was any way to undo the damage he'd caused. He knew he didn't deserve forgiveness, but he couldn't shake the hope that maybe, just maybe, Claire might give him another chance. One chilly autumn evening, after finishing a grueling shift at the warehouse, Ryan decided to visit Claire's new apartment. He stood outside her building for what felt like an eternity, rehearsing what he would say in his head. He wanted to be sincere, humble, honest, but most importantly, he wanted her to understand how much he regretted everything. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage he had left, he climbed the stairs to her door and knocked softly. The sound echoed faintly in the quiet hallway, each second stretching into an eternity as he waited for her to answer. When the door opened, Claire stood there, her expression unreadable. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back into a loose bun. In her arms, Ava cooed softly, her tiny fingers grasping at the air. Seeing them together, a picture of resilience and strength, made Ryan's throat tighten with emotion. "Claire," he began, his voice trembling. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I needed to see you. To talk to you." Claire didn't invite him in. Instead, she leaned slightly against the doorframe, her gaze steady and unwavering. "What do you want, Ryan?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. Ryan swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her eyes. I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. I was selfish, reckless, and blind to what really mattered, you and Ava. I've spent every day since trying to make sense of what I did, trying to become someone better. Someone worthy of your trust." He paused, searching her face for any sign of softening, but found none. Still, he pressed on. "I'm not asking for us to go back to the way things were. I know that's impossible. But I'm begging you, for Ava's sake, to let me be part of her life. To prove to both of you that I can change." Claire listened silently, her expression unchanged. When Ryan finished speaking, she shifted Ava gently in her arms and took a deep breath. "Ryan," she said evenly, you hurt me in ways I never thought possible. You betrayed me, humiliated me, and put our daughter's life at risk because of your selfishness. Do you have any idea how hard it's been for me to rebuild my life without you? How hard it is to trust anyone again?" Ryan nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I do," he whispered hoarsely. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making up for it, if you'll let me." But Claire shook her head, her resolve unshaken. "It's not about letting you or forgiving you, Ryan. It's about moving forward. Ava and I are building a life together, a good one. We don't need you to be happy. We don't need you at all." Her words hit him like a freight train, stealing the breath from his lungs. He wanted to argue, to plead, to convince her otherwise, but deep down, he knew she was right. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. "I understand," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "You're amazing, Claire. Both of you are. And I'm so sorry for everything." With that, he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped and his heart heavy. As he descended the stairs, the weight of his actions crashed over him once more. He had lost everything, his family, his career, his dignity, all because of his own selfishness. There was no going back, no rewriting the past. All he could do now was face the future alone. Later that night, as Claire tucked Ava into her crib, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about Ryan's apology, his desperation, his pain. Part of her felt a flicker of sympathy, but it was fleeting. She had spent too long picking up the pieces of her shattered life to entertain thoughts of giving him another chance. Her priority was Ava, and herself. Together, they were strong. Together, they were whole. As she turned off the light and closed the nursery door behind her, Claire whispered softly to herself, "We're going to be okay." And this time, she truly believed it. The morning sunlight poured through the large windows of Claire's cozy new home, casting a warm glow over the living room. Balloons and soft pastel colors floated lazily near the ceiling, and a banner that read, "Happy First Birthday, Ava," hung proudly above the fireplace. It had been exactly 1 year since the night of her birthday party, the night that shattered her world, but today was different. Today wasn't about heartbreak or betrayal, it was about celebration. About resilience. About rebirth. Claire stood in the kitchen, humming softly as she carefully frosted a small vanilla cake adorned with edible flowers. Each swirl of frosting felt like a stroke of triumph, a reminder of how far she'd come. She glanced over at Ava, who sat happily in her high chair, clapping her hands and babbling excitedly at the colorful decorations around her. At 13 months old, Ava was thriving, her cheeks rosy, her laughter infectious, her spirit unbreakable. She was the light that had guided Claire through the darkest days. Lisa bustled into the kitchen carrying plates of appetizers, her floral dress swishing as she moved. "Okay, spill," she said with a grin, setting the plates down on the counter. "What's with the fancy cake? You trying to show off your baking skills now?" Claire chuckled, smoothing out the last bit of frosting. "Maybe a little. But mostly, I just wanted everything to be perfect for her first birthday. She deserves it." Lisa stepped closer, wrapping an arm around Claire's shoulders. "You've done an incredible job, you know that? Raising her on your own, building this life. You're amazing, sis." Tears pricked at the corners of Claire's eyes, but she blinked them away, smiling instead. "Thanks, Lise. I couldn't have done it without you." As the afternoon wore on, close friends began arriving. One by one, they filled the house with laughter, chatter, and love. There were no strangers here, only people who had stood by Claire during her hardest moments. They brought gifts wrapped in shiny paper, cooed over Ava's adorable outfits, and marveled at how much she'd grown in just a year. The atmosphere was joyful, light-hearted, and full of hope, a stark contrast to the pain that had once consumed this family. When it was time for the cake ceremony, everyone gathered around the dining table, where Ava sat perched in her high chair, wide-eyed and curious about the glowing candle placed before her. Claire held up her glass, signaling for everyone's attention. "I just want to say a few words," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "This past year has been, well, let's just say it hasn't been easy. There were times when I didn't think I could keep going, times when the weight of everything felt unbearable. But through it all, I learned something important. Strength isn't about never falling, it's about getting back up, even when you don't think you can." She paused, glancing down at Ava, whose tiny fingers reached out toward the flickering flame. "I also learned what real love looks like, not the kind that breaks you, but the kind that builds you up. The love I have for my daughter, for my sister, for myself. That's the kind of love worth fighting for." Her gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of those who had supported her every step of the way. So today isn't just about celebrating Ava's first birthday, it's about celebrating survival. Resilience. Growth. We've all been through so much, but we're still here. Still standing. And that's something worth raising a glass to. Everyone cheered, lifting their glasses in unison as Claire bent down to help Ava blow out the candle. As the flame sputtered and went out, Claire leaned close to her daughter's ear and whispered, "Happy rebirth day, sweetheart." Ava giggled, clapping her hands enthusiastically, completely unaware of the significance of the moment, but Claire knew. This wasn't just another milestone, it was a testament to everything they had overcome together. A symbol of renewal, of starting anew. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, Lisa lingered behind to help clean up. She watched Claire tuck Ava into her crib, brushing a kiss against the baby's forehead before turning off the light. When Claire rejoined her in the living room, Lisa handed her a cup of tea and smiled knowingly. "You did good, Claire," she said softly. "Really good." Claire took a sip of her tea, gazing out the window at the stars twinkling in the night sky. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Her journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught her invaluable lessons about forgiveness, not of others, but of herself. About finding joy in the midst of pain, and about embracing life not despite its challenges, but because of them. "Yeah," she murmured, her lips curving into a contented smile. "We did." And with that, she settled onto the couch, letting the quiet comfort of the evening wash over her. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, but for now, all was right in her world. The camera pans slowly across Claire's living room, now quiet after the lively celebration. The remnants of Ava's first birthday party linger, a half-eaten cake on the table, balloons bobbing gently against the ceiling, and a few forgotten gifts scattered around the edges of the room. The soft glow of string lights casts a warm, golden hue over everything, as if wrapping the space in a comforting embrace. It's peaceful here, serene, a stark contrast to the storm that once raged within these walls. As the scene settles, a calm and reflective voice begins to narrate, guiding the audience through one final moment of introspection. "Life has a way of testing us," the narrator says softly, their tone gentle yet profound. "It throws challenges at us when we least expect them, forcing us to confront our deepest fears, our greatest vulnerabilities." For Claire Mitchell, those tests came in waves: betrayal, loss, heartbreak, all culminating in a moment that could have broken her completely. Yet here she stands today, not just surviving, but thriving. The camera shifts to focus on Claire herself, now seated on the couch with a mug of tea cradled in her hands. Her expression is thoughtful, content, a far cry from the woman who once sat frozen in shock at her birthday party. Beside her, Ava sleeps soundly in her bassinet, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Claire's journey wasn't easy, the narrator continues. She faced betrayal not only from the man she loved but also from someone she never saw coming. She endured public humiliation, physical pain, and the daunting responsibility of raising a child alone. But through it all, she discovered something extraordinary within herself: resilience. Strength. The courage to rebuild her life, not for anyone else, but for herself and her daughter. The screen fades to black momentarily, leaving only the narrator's voice to carry the message forward. Betrayal leaves scars, they say, their words echoing with quiet conviction. Scars that remind us of where we've been, of lessons learned the hard way. But those scars don't define us unless we let them. Claire chose to rise above her circumstances, to transform her pain into power. And in doing so, she taught us all an important lesson: no matter how dark the night may seem, dawn always follows. The visuals return, this time showing clips of Claire throughout her journey, the tearful moments in the hospital, the quiet determination as she packed up her old life, the joyous laughter shared with Lisa during quieter days at home. Each frame captures a piece of her transformation, a testament to her strength and perseverance. And now, the narrator says, their tone shifting slightly to invite reflection, we ask you, have you ever faced betrayal that changed your life? A moment so devastating it forced you to reevaluate everything you thought you knew about trust, love, or even yourself? If you have, know this, you are not alone. Stories like Claire's remind us that healing is possible, that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to grow despite the pain. The screen transitions to a simple text overlay against a soft background, *, share your story. How did you overcome betrayal? * below it, social media handles and hashtags appear, encouraging viewers to engage with the narrative beyond the video. But perhaps more importantly, the narrator adds, their voice warm and reassuring, remember this, resilience isn't about never falling, it's about getting back up every time you do. Life will knock you down, but it's what you choose to build afterward that truly matters. Claire rebuilt hers with love, forgiveness, not of others, but of herself, and an unwavering commitment to creating a better future for her daughter. The final shot lingers on Claire once more, this time standing by the window as sunlight streams in behind her. She gazes out at the horizon, her silhouette framed by hope and possibility. The narrator delivers their closing words, leaving the audience with a sense of empowerment and optimism. So whatever challenges you're facing today, wherever you find yourself in your own journey, take heart. Like Claire, you have the strength to rise above. To heal. To move forward. Because sometimes, the hardest chapters in our lives lead to the most beautiful rebirths. The screen fades to black, accompanied by a single line of text in elegant white font, *, to resilience. To new beginnings. *. And then, silence. Betrayal is a universal experience, yet it feels deeply personal when it happens to us. Claire's story reminds us that life can take unexpected turns, sometimes cruel, sometimes unfair, but it's not the events themselves that define us, it's how we respond to them. Her journey teaches us that resilience isn't about avoiding pain or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about facing it head-on, learning from it, and using it as fuel to create something stronger, better, and more beautiful than before. Claire didn't just survive, she thrived. She chose self-love over bitterness, growth over stagnation, and hope over despair. And while her path wasn't easy, she proved that even in our darkest moments, there's always room for light. Her story challenges each of us to ask ourselves, what will you do with your pain? Will you let it break you, or will you rise above it? If Claire's journey resonated with you, if it inspired you, moved you, or reminded you of your own strength, then don't miss out on more stories like this. Stories of courage, transformation, and triumph. Subscribe to our channel and join a community dedicated to exploring the complexities of human experiences. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, because every week, we bring you new tales that will leave you thinking, feeling, and growing. Your story matters too, and together, we can continue to inspire one another to face life's challenges with grace and grit. So subscribe now, and let's keep these conversations alive.